Hey guys,
Howdy.
we will of course give everyone a few minutes to arrive. Does anybody have a an epic fail from Thanksgiving that they want to share? I had a culinary epic fail. Anybody else? No.
Do tell.
Yeah, go
Okay,
ahead.
so it wasn't like A Christmas Story, the movie where the neighbor's dogs come in and take the turkey off the table. Although that's a hilarious scene. No, we had two culinary fails. One was with cranberry sauce. Tried a new recipe with grapefruit and honey. I don't know why we thought that was going to be good, but it was a recipe out of a magazine, and it was terrible. And I make a chocolate cream pie is one of the pies typically at Thanksgiving, and I just uh, put the filling together and forgot 2 cups of milk, and it turned into just chocolate candy instead of a chocolate cream pie. So yeah, those were my Thanksgiving fails.
At
It
least
was still
that's
a good
still
good
edible
Thanksgiving.
though.
Yeah, that one was, you're right. And all the other food was great, and so it was all good. But yeah,
Good.
welcome the rest of you. While we're waiting for everyone to arrive, I was just recounting culinary fails over Thanksgiving. A really terrible cranberry sauce and a chocolate cream pie that didn't have much cream to it.
Have you ever used powdered sugar instead of flour trying to make gravy?
I haven't done that. Did that happen to you this Thanksgiving, or was that a
No,
prior?
that's a prior of one of my brother-in-law. So we tease him about it every year. It
That's
doesn't
great.
work.
Well, I don't know how many of you have vegetarians in your household. We have one in ours, and as a former vegetarian, I have sympathy for her. Uh, and so it's always a question of like how many gravies are going to be necessary during Thanksgiving. Is it going to be just the vegetarian gravy, or does it have to be the traditional plus the vegetarian gravy? This year, the meat eaters deferred to just vegetarian gravy, and it was still pretty good. So. I don't know about the rest of you. Thanksgiving has always been my favorite holiday. And for those of you that are just joining and wondering why we're talking about Thanksgiving at this working group meeting, I'm stalling as people enter the room and have time to arrive. So that's why this is idle banter. But Thanksgiving has always been one of my favorite holidays because the expectations are so low, right? It's uh, likely bad conversation with relatives that you may not really enjoy, and just eating, just eating food, which I'm really good at. And so, yeah, Thanksgiving is definitely one of my favorite holidays. No gifts necessary, no high holy days involved. Yeah. Okay. It looks like we have a critical mass of people, and my cell phone says it's 104. So why don't we get started? And I'm sure a couple more folks will join us along the way. Um, I'm going to dispense with introductions because we've all talked to each other. So welcome to the December 4th, 2025 Tier 3 working group meeting. I am recording the meeting, so just know that the recording will be made available on the website, the Tier 3 website, probably early next week, including all my Thanksgiving rants. And I want to acknowledge that we haven't actually met, I think, since August. Um, and since that time, the first draft, or I guess it's really the second draft, but the first public draft of the Tier 3 rules was publicized. And we held 4 public engagement sessions around the state in late October. So a bunch has happened since we last had a chance to talk. And so, as I explained in my email to get you all here, this meeting is my intent with this meeting is to give you an opportunity to sound off and to give specific suggestions about the current draft 2.1, dated October 8th, of the tier 3 rules and the associated mapping. Hopefully you've had some time to think about it. And what I'm hoping for is like comments or suggestions that you think would be beneficial for the group to talk about. So I've told all of you that I'd really love to get your written comments, specific comments, by December 15th. And I'm still happy to take them, of course. And so the point of today is really to say, hey, I've been thinking about this thing, and I think the discussion at the work group would be helpful. Those are the kind of comments I'd love to get us going on today for the 2 hours we have to chat with each other. And then, as I indicated in the email, I've been doing some thinking based on the feedback I've gotten from some of you and from members of the public at those engagement sessions about ways to refine the current draft. And so I'm interested in getting the working group's thoughts on some of those questions that I posed in the email, which I'm happy to reiterate. So that's my intent for today. And why don't, unless anybody has a procedural question, actually, yes, let me address the procedure first. Where we are in the process is I will be working on a refined draft and refined mapping for the rest of this month for tier 3. I will be bringing that to the board to review in January in the hopes of finalizing a third draft of the rules and the mapping by the end of January, so that in February and March, there can be another round of public engagement and feedback. And this is all an iterative process to get us to May of 2026, when we hope to have a final draft and a final public hearing on the tier 3 rules. So that's where we are now. We're about halfway through the process. Yeah, December involves making revisions and tuning this up with input from everyone, including all of you. So enough table setting. Hopefully everyone who's going to be here is here. Any procedural questions before I start calling on people? Yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for that update. So there would be today's meeting and then an opportunity to provide written comments. Do you foresee that being sort of the extent which you'd get stakeholder input before going out with a new draft to the public, or would you see another opportunity for the stakeholder group to continue to bat around or refine ideas before it goes out to the public again?
That's a great question. I think I'm open to having another one of these in January, as the board starts to talk about it and we start moving towards a third draft. I'm also open to just allowing stakeholders who have the interest to interact with me specifically or the board at those meetings on their own, as opposed to having a working group discussion. So that's a long-winded way of saying I don't know. I don't have another working group meeting programmed for January, but if after today the group is interested in that, or even after the holidays turn over and we're into January, the group is interested in that, I'm happy to schedule one.
I guess one just quick thought is I think it's really key to get public input through this whole process. That's really important. And I think that this is, as we all know, I mean, Act 181 and this tier in particular offers a number of complicated things to think through. And I think the rule is, it's in progress. And so I guess I would just register some concern about going out with a rule that still has a lot of concepts that may be fuzzy or need refinement. I think it would be better to sort of have it as baked as possible with as much critical thinking that you could benefit from this group and other conversations before it goes out to the public again. And so I would be on in favor of more process here. People are up for it to try and get to rectify more of the details where I think there is, confusion or concern from the public. Thanks.
Gotcha. Thanks, Jamie, for that perspective. I appreciate it. Anybody else have a question about sort of process and or suggestion on that front before we start talking the details?
I guess just one other thought suggestion. We all, and I think you have been focusing a lot on kind of the substance of the rule, but in my experience, kind of a rulemaking of this nature, the actual like structure of the rule is significantly more formal and longer. And I think we would all benefit from kind of seeing it in a more kind of formal rule framework sooner than later, just because, as those details start to get fleshed out, sometimes you learn more about the substance. So, I think your working draft is a good one to kind of vet issues and questions, bring kind of decision points to the group, but at some point seeing it like through a lawyer's lens might be helpful.
Gotcha. That's a helpful suggestion, Billy. And yes, it has not been reviewed by our legal team at the Land Use Review Board yet. And I suspect that they will have something to say about it when it is in front of them. So getting that done, you're saying get that done sooner rather than later so the working group can see something that's more fleshed out with that perspective in it.
I think that would be helpful.
Somebody likes to read legalese, and we know who that is now. Thank you, Billy. Go ahead, Megan.
Thanks. I don't know how to take my hand down. I can't believe I got it up. Oh, there it is.
Well done.
I think, I think the timing piece is big. The 6 questions that you have on here are the right questions for me. They're also massive. And I'm worried, and I think in what, Jamie's saying about that input piece, I am worried that these are really massive things that we are trying to do on a very tight timeline. And that if we need more time to ensure that these things are done right, that we need to be really open and thinking about that question as well as these 6 questions. Because I think there are a lot of people who are very nervous about all of this. And if we're trying to get it done now because it has to get done now, rather than think about all of these and I know you're going to spend the rest of the month on them, but I think there are a lot of people who need to give input and that it's going to take time to really work through them. So I just want to put out there that I hope there's some openness to also thinking about, do we need more time to really get this right, and not just how do we get it done on a specified timeline, because that's the timeline that's in place. And the other piece is that we can't look at this in a vacuum. This is part of the entirety of the changes to Act 250. And if things aren't working in the processes for other tiers, that impacts how this works. So I think it's important to not just talk about tier 3, but how are things going with tier 1? What is the public input there? And how are things, what are we hearing about the guidance on tier 2? Because all of that is playing into the public and political sentiment around this process and these drafts.
Thanks, Megan. Just a point of clarification, we have already extended the time horizon for this from what was in the statute. So originally we were supposed to have a draft rule to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. I think it was, well, I forget the date now. I think it was February 15th or something like that. And we've pushed that out to June. And there's even a little bit of slack in that because tier 3 doesn't actually go into effect until December 31st of next year. So over a year from now. But I take the point, and I'm glad the questions I posed were, at least some of them were good ones in your mind, even if they are big. Okay. Anybody else before we dive in? Yeah, go ahead, Warren.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Alex, I think it'd be helpful for you. I know we're not talking about the road rule, but obviously it's on people's minds, and there is some connection with the tier 3 and the habitat crossings and how that's been sort of viewed, to maybe just lay out procedurally where the LURB is at in developing guidance, so we know what that timeline looks like, and people just know what know what the expectations are there.
Yeah, sure. Happy to just speak to that briefly. So the information about the guidance that we're preparing on the road construction jurisdiction provision, i.e. the road rule, that information is on our website. There's a page just like tier 3 that indicates that we are working on it and what the time horizon is. But in a nutshell, we want to have draft guidance available in January, February, so that folks can have a look at it and give us some feedback, and then formalize that guidance thereafter, hopefully February, March. The idea being we would like to have guidance for Vermonters and interest groups, to have well in advance of the July 1st effective date of the road rule. And that's about the best we can do at this point. I can't really tell you what's going to be in that guidance. I mean, I can tell you that it's underway, that 2 board members, Sarah Had and Kirsten Sultan, are leading that effort. And that just understanding the difference and the definitions of a road versus a driveway is one big ticket item that the guidance is, I believe the guidance will address. But there are other aspects as well. So stay tuned and look for that in January. Probably, I was hoping that it would be early January, but at this point, I'm guessing it will more likely be late January that we will promulgate some draft of the guidance that we're preparing for that. Just to be clear, though, we're not proposing to do rulemaking on the road rule at this time, even though the statute gives us that ability. So we are simply going to be providing guidance on what we feel the interpretation of the statute is. We're not seeking to sort of make new law through rulemaking at this time. Okay. Any other big picture questions or thoughts before we jump in? Okay, hearing none. Yeah, before we dive into the questions that I sent out, I am interested to hear if any of you as stakeholders have a suggested revision, a concern with regard to the mapping. I mean, we all have concerns with regard to the mapping, so strike that. But, a specific issue that you'd like to talk about before we jump into some of the questions that I've been thinking about. Seth, go ahead.
Thank you, Alex, and I apologize, everyone. My home computer has problems with the camera, so you're just going to see my initials today. And I sent you these some thoughts via email, but I think it's worth at least raising the issue with the full group. The one issue that I think needs to be fleshed out more in the rule is the disproportionate impact issue, specifically in statute. I don't think it's enough for us to say, yes, we talked about it and decided that what we've done doesn't have disproportionate impacts. There needs to be a greater level of due process for people who feel, and communities and regions who feel they are facing a disproportionate impact. I outlined some specific ideas in my email, Alex. I don't know if you want to get into that level of detail today. I'm happy to, but I know that there's also an agenda. If this is an appropriate time to.
Beth, your thoughts are really intriguing, and I think it would be worth talking about them. And they're really just 2, right? And I think they can be summarized pretty quickly. So maybe you could summarize each of them, one at a time, and then we could talk about them.
Oh, okay. So part 1 is a section in the rule explicitly about disproportionate impact, and I outlined 2 that I felt were relevant. There may be others that I have a blind spot for, but the 2 were regions that are already meeting their 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 conservation goals. and or regions where less than 5% of the area is eligible for tier 1B or 1A, that tier 3 should not be in effect in those regions because either they have already met the balance in statute for conservation by meeting their 30 by 50 or 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 goals, or such a small area is currently eligible for tier 1A or 1B that there's a clear disproportionate impact of adding 10% or more of the land area to tier 3. So that was part one. Part
So
two.
Hold on,
Yep.
Steph, stop there just so, because nobody else has had the benefit of seeing your email. So
Yes.
let me just summarize part one. What Seth is saying, and you'll correct me if I misspeak, Seth, is that in order to address the disproportionate impact, communities that certain communities would have tier 3 essentially turned off. And those would
Yes.
be communities that either have already met the 30 by 30 or 50 by 50 conservation goal, or communities that have tier 1 eligible areas that are, what did you say, Seth? Less than 5% of the land area or something like
Less
that?
than 5% of the land area. Yep.
Yeah. So the upshot is like you meet one of these criteria and tier 3 doesn't happen in your, I don't know which unit of geographic space you're talking about, Seth, like your region, your county, your municipality, something like that.
Yep. And then the second piece was specifically in the exemptions related to water and wastewater infrastructure, that water and wastewater infrastructure components that serve a downtown or village center or related neighborhood areas would not be subject to additional tier 3 review. The rationale for that is that infrastructure is a prerequisite for entering either tier 1A or 1B. And so adding an additional regulatory barrier creates a disproportionate impact for communities making the upgrades in their village centers that they need to be tier 1A and B eligible. And another rationale is there are already at least 3 layers of state review. The DEC's NEPA process, which looks at wetlands, endangered species, archaeological resources, everything that Act 250 looks at. There's also the indirect discharge review for wastewater, the public water system review that looks at basically all the criteria 1 and criteria 9 issues. And then finally, all of these land use areas are ultimately approved by the Land Use Review Board, which looks at the land use and community development issues to ensure that state planning goals are being met. So creating a 4th level of review for something that is required and a prerequisite for entering tier 1A or 1B seems duplicative and seems like it's creating a disproportionate impact on communities that have not already been able to make those investments in their villages and downtowns. So those are my 2 suggestions.
And so just to put the Alex like quick little, this is what this means to me spin on it. Thanks for indulging, Seth. Well, the way I see that idea is right now in the draft rule, future land use areas that are mapped that have potential eligibility for tier 1, any tier 3 areas per the current draft would be excluded from those areas, right? With the board doesn't want to impact a community's ability to have tier 1 designation for Act 250 exemptions. But what Seth is saying is, okay, great, you've excluded tier 3 from those areas, but what if there's perfect soils just outside of those areas that a community needs to leverage for a wastewater system, but that happens to be in a tier 3 area? So we should exempt those sorts of water, wastewater infrastructure from the requirement for a permit in tier 3 areas. Did I get that right, Seth?
You got that absolutely right. Yeah,
Okay.
it generally isn't a good idea to have your well head protection area right in the middle of your downtown. There's lots of conflicts when you do that, but so they're usually outside, and so are soil-based wastewater systems, for example.
So yeah, let's start talking about these. I think one is a lot smaller in terms of its potential impact to the rule and the intent of the legislation than the other. That would be the exemption for wastewater systems and water systems that Seth's talking about. I think this idea of turning off tier 3 in certain areas because of the disproportionate impact, the way that he's suggesting, is bigger. That's a much bigger, issue. But go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I hope it's okay. Samantha might join because I might need to leave. And so
Totally
just
fine.
having two brains as we think about submitting comments. And I find Seth's comments really interesting. And it sort of is more of, I think, elevates a need that do we have enough time to get this right? I know it's the extended deadline. You've already talked about that, but your very set of questions, if we make a decision to change some of those, could have Seth's proposal be less relevant or needed, or even more. And so, there's just, I think we're all struggling with, or many of us are struggling with the same thing. There's some disproportionate impact in certain areas that maybe have an undue, conflict we didn't think about, and what's the right way to adjust those, reach some sort of big consensus here is going to take more time. And I know you're on this clock. So that's just what I wanted to say, kicking around in my head.
Gotcha. Well, we're all human beings with very large gray matter, and we can think about multiple variables at the same time, but we can also get swamped when we try to do too much. So I think it's okay to talk about Seth's specific suggestions while also understanding that the questions I posed might be driving us in a direction that would obviate the need to go in the direction that Seth is talking about. We can weigh both at the same time. And right now, I'd love to hear other working group members' responses or thoughts about what Seth's suggesting. Charlie?
Thanks, Alex. I just had a clarifying question on the mapping as it relates to the exemptions or exclusion areas. The red hatched areas that show up on the maps now, could you give some background as to, are those placeholders, or how are the boundaries defined? Because looking at a few of them, they don't seem to match designated growth areas. They look more like circular polygons that were kind of overlaid with centers.
Yep. Yeah, good question. So those exclusion areas, the red hatching on the tier 3 mapping, are placeholders. So they were an attempt to show where exclusion areas, because they were going to be mapped as growth areas within the regional plan structure, might be. So they're just placeholders, they're not exact, and they're based on the current interim Act 250 exemption areas, which are, they stem from the designations, the designation program, village centers, downtowns, neighborhood development areas, and a certain distance buffer around those. That's why they look sort of bubbly. But yeah, they are just placeholders, and the actual future land use mapping that the regional plans are affecting, those will be the determining factors of where those exclusion areas really are. And they will be focused on the future land use areas that have some potential to be tier 1 eligible. So downtown centers, village centers, planned growth areas, and village areas, those 4. Peter, go ahead.
Great. So, just going back to Seth's discussion of disproportionate impacts and kind of what area would those, how would you consider, or what area would be considered? Is that by town, or is it a larger area? I'm just not sure. And guess,
good question.
open it. Yeah.
Yeah, Seth, help us out, because I wasn't sure either when I got your email. What were you thinking?
So I had started at the regional level, given that there's going to be regions that have larger urban centers and in more rural communities. But I'd be happy to have that discussion about whether there should be different criteria for regional impact versus municipal impact.
Okay. Adam?
So I want to support Seth's idea and Seth's very, very real sense of disproportional impact, especially as compared with tier 1A and 1B communities, especially given some of the early feedback I've heard from the LURB on a couple of the Regional Planning Commission maps that have already gone in. These are future land use maps. The tier 1B areas are intended to support housing. It seems like they've been, some of the comments have, we've engaged with our towns. We've done a lot of public outreach. We've really tried to support, good sized areas that will allow us to meet the housing targets that are set are really one of the big things out of this legislation. And, it seems that those areas, there are comments from the LURB that make me worry those areas are going to be very constricted still. And I see these tier 3 areas just expanding over time, and disproportionality is very real and something we need to pay attention to.
Thanks,
That's my comment.
Adam. Yeah, I appreciate that. So supportive of Seth's idea, and in part because of the tier 1 connection, which Megan was also highlighting. Just to get it out there, John Groveman just asked me if I could forward Seth's email to the group so that you could all see what he's talking about. And so I'm going to do that right now. And you're going to need to check your email if you want to look at it. It's going to be a little hard to do that in the course of the meeting, but I'll do that as best I can right now. While I'm clicking away, if someone else would like to chime in on Seth's suggestion, Jamie, go ahead. Talk while I type.
Yeah, thanks. Just in understanding, Seth, your proposal, would it be that if there's less than 5%, however the geographic area is defined, of tier 1, then there would be no ability to have tier 3 in that area? Or would it be some kind of recalculation to have some kind of equity with the tier 1, like percentage? Just trying to understand if it basically would potentially, how much it potentially knocks out tier 3, because I don't know the percentages of what tier 1 is coming out to be yet.
As I drafted it as a starting point of discussion, it was that tier 3 would not be in effect in those regions or communities. But I suspect other stakeholders will have counter thoughts on that, which is fine for a collaborative deliberative process. But that was the starting point in my email.
I mean,
For
what it's worth, what I've heard about the tier 1 eligible areas from the different RPC regions range from as small as 0.6 to 13-14%, say in Chittenden County, with the average being about 2%. So, if you can imagine, the 0.6 is NVDA, Chittenden County's 13-14%, and others are falling in the 1 to 3%, 4% area. It's gonna vary quite a bit. And then of course within the regions, if you go to the municipal level, it's even going to be more of a variation.
I would find it helpful to have a real world example. Show me a town or region where you're proposing this, because I'm concerned this discussion is going away from what the goal of this tier 3 is, which is to increase ecological protections in sensitive areas. And I did attend all of the public hearings, And I appreciated a lot of the comments about the disproportionality and the potential cost shifting. I think that's a very legitimate concern. On the other hand, I am also seeing that the opportunity with tier 3 is to send red flags to say, hey, don't develop here, find a better place. But just asserting Act 250 jurisdiction doesn't mean there's no development. And so this discussion about exempting areas, or it's just like, how can we make it work? That's what I'd like to see us focus on, instead of starting to carve away something that we really haven't even figured out what it is yet. Some of the comments that I heard from people that got my attention were people who have, properties where they have no choice but to develop in a place like that, but they don't have the money to go through Act 250. I think that is a very legitimate issue. But then, and especially when it has to do with roads and wildlife habitat connectivity, but then I'm pretty sure that was former ANR Secretary Jonathan Wood who spoke, who said that the mapping isn't ground truthed. And I think that's a big question. And then we have on the significant natural communities, what's happening with the agreement with landowners that those wouldn't be used for regulatory processes. So I think we have real issues to look at sorting out with the tier 3 areas that we've identified. Could we work on that before we start carving out whole areas where they would apply? Thank you.
Yeah, and we these are big ideas that Seth just put forward, so we don't have to have closure on the conversation about them today. But does anybody else have any thoughts on those before we move the conversation along? Okay, then let's keep going. I do want to acknowledge what Annette said, because I agree that we are in the process of refining the mapping that we started with, and my thought coming out of the public engagement sessions was that in the next version of the mapping, it will be honed, it will be potentially reduced in terms of these habitat connectors, and we'll have a better sense of land area impacted by municipality and region to be able to understand better whether there are disproportionate impacts, and we'll be better able to identify who we need to be doing outreach to. So I appreciate Seth's suggestions a lot, but I also agree with Annette that to some degree, if we blow it up before we get to the refinement phase, we may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Okay. Anybody else have a out of the box idea like Seth's, or an in the box idea that they want to share?
Just one thing I want to put out there, Alex, is we continue to be really concerned about the tier 3 involved lands concept. First of all, it's using terminology that already exists in Act 250 and has a totally different meaning, and it's just going to be utterly confusing for people to call this involved lands. And then from like an implementation perspective, if you just kind of play out the scenario where something that's adjacent but not directly impacting a tier 3 area is included into Act 250 jurisdiction, like what happens if then that structure is modified in the future? It just gets really weird quick. So I would really encourage a lot more thought about the real world implications and kind of application of that concept.
So Billy, let me just push you on that a little bit. I get what you're saying about the terminology, but I'm guessing that if we just picked a different term and didn't use the term involved lands, that the concern that underlies it would still be there. So yes. Help me understand again what the concern is, because the intent with the draft was to say we're only concerned with and we're only going to extend jurisdiction within tier 3 areas that are actually being impacted, except when you for example, have a proposed building site that's half in and half out. And in that case, we're going to expand outside of the tier 3 area to encompass the full envelope of that building, because it doesn't seem logical to cut the building in half from a jurisdictional standpoint. So what are your concerns on that front?
Sure, there's two initial ones. I don't have it in front of me. I believe the draft rule does also talk about like other infrastructure and appurtenances that are necessary to support that impact, such as driveways, septic systems, things of that nature. So like when is that decision made of like like that's a jurisdictional determination. Like when's that going to be made? Who's going to make it? That just, unless the rule is really clear about, what that kind of what gets pulled into tier 3 under those scenarios, it's going to be confusing to implement. And the other one is, in the example you gave, if there's a building half in tier 3, half out, and someone wants to some years later add an addition to that portion that's outside of the resource, like, do you need to get an Act 250 amendment? Like, what happens there, right? Like if there's no real direct impact to the tier 3 resource going forward, what happens?
Gotcha. So that's a really good example. So you're right. The current draft does address this. It's in section 6. And here's the relevant sentence. It says, jurisdiction shall extend far enough outside the tier 3 area to include the entirety of any structures that are partially inside the tier 3 area. For all other improvements, jurisdiction shall extend outside the tier 3 area far enough to include the discrete improvement, but in no case shall jurisdiction extend any further than 100 feet outside the tier 3 area. So I think the way it's crafted, there is a clear line. It's 100 feet beyond the tier 3 delineation. But your point about, okay, Alex, you gave me a structure that's cut in half. What happens to 5 years later when the person wants to add on to it outside of the tier 3 area? That's a good one. Yeah, Charlie.
Thanks. Following on the involved land conversation, two other things that have come to mind is one's around recreational trails. And how we're looking at involved lands for trail networks that are connected to specifically, and at what point does involved become all involved with trail networks. And the other one that came to mind had to do with involved land as it relates to the use of a structure that's constructed. What we've seen, an example that I can point to that we've seen at FPR is where, say, a small sawmill operation gets put in on a property. And they occasionally will mill out a handful of trees from a property that mill is on. And some of these properties, White Rock Farm is a good example, are hundreds of acres, and they've caused the entire property to be brought under Act 250 jurisdiction because the sawmill is potentially using wood from the property sometimes, therefore it's involved land. And it creates conflicts where current use plans have to get amended. Other things that are connected to this need to be addressed as well. And so I guess my question is involved strictly related to physical involvement, or is involved also related to what the use of the structure is within the tier 3 area as it relates to the remainder of the land?
Okay, I think I understand what you're talking about. Although that example, yeah, that confused me a little bit. Well, I think in terms of what the current draft says, it's a geographic connection and it's a discrete one within that boundary that I mentioned of 100 feet from the boundary of the tier 3 area. So it's not, at least as it's currently envisioned, it's not about use. It's about physical on the ground in footprint in relation to the tier 3 delineation.
Okay, so I think just as Billy was pointing out earlier, just being more clear as to how that language is used in tier 3 versus globally with an Act 250 would be helpful.
Yeah. Well, got it. Duly noted. Okay. Anyone else have an idea, a constructive piece of criticism? A monkey wrench? Go ahead, Jamie.
So I'll just throw out a couple of ideas on sort of the proactive side, because I think we could look at, the concern from the public and the question here that we have around the scope of the connectivity areas. I think we could look at, is the scope right? Is it being defined the right way? Does it need to be modified? I think we could also look at, other approaches that will address, I think, some of the concern out there that this is going to have, the effect it's going to have. So I think one is that I've heard people suggest that people won't be able to make modifications to their existing home or structures. And so I think the exemption, originally there was a proposal, a third of an acre. I think we're, batting around, what would that third of an acre be floating? Would it be close to existing infrastructure? And as I recall, I'd suggested maybe make that closer to existing infrastructure, but I think what happened is, maybe, and this was a decision by the LURB, it's now been constricted to 200 square feet. So I think it's worth us spending some time trying to figure out what would a reasonable exemption be, so that people can do improvements to their house or make modifications without necessarily triggering this. The other idea is that that was out there, and I know there's maybe some legal considerations around this, but I still think it's a good idea to try and limit the criteria to those that are applicable to the tier 3 resource, as a way to try and make it more efficient, not as onerous. The other idea that I would put on the table would be, for the connectivity areas, and still need to think this through and need sort of some advice from the LURB or others here who have been involved with sort of the functioning of administration of Act 250. If you have a connectivity area, I guess I'm thinking in my mind, it's the fragmentation criteria that maybe is the most important consideration as far as how site design would happen in a connectivity area. So I don't know if there would be the opportunity for somebody who potentially would be under Act 250 jurisdiction in a connectivity area to file, I guess we could consider it like a JO opinion. And they could articulate how they think they're in compliance with, let's say, criterion 8C. And if there's a determination that they are, then you don't go through Act 250. There may be other criteria that's relevant that I would need to think about. So it's just like very fresh idea, just trying to think outside of the box on how to make this sort of workable. And so that way, this would not be necessarily automatic Act 250 jurisdiction, unless basically it's demonstrated that you're not complying with 8C, and there's going to be an undue fragmentation impact, and that's going to have to be addressed somehow by going through the process. The last thing I guess I'll say is just throwing out that for a long time, and Alex, I know I've talked to you about this, I've been concerned about the maps that are out there that the public sees that sort of shows the road rule as basically applying at 800 feet. And I know it does relate to our conversation on the connectivity areas, because we've been looking at the road rule will have some effect at a certain distance. Therefore, we need to look at the connectivity areas shoring up where there may be impacts that are not covered by the road rule. I think there's a lot of confusion in the public thinking that 800 feet is being interpreted as an automatic jurisdictional threshold. And you cross over that and you're in Act 250. I think there's a lot of confusion from the public thinking that the road rule is going to apply to single driveways that are 800 feet. And as you said, it's super important for the LURB to provide clarity on the definition of a driveway and road, because at least my understanding how the road rule used to work is a road is serving multiple lots. I think it may have been 3 in the past. A driveway is serving a single lot. And so I think the public is confused over this. And I don't think the intention was to include single family driveway access in an 800-foot trigger. So as we look at the road rule and as we look at the connectivity areas, I think it's really important that we try and understand the extent to which the road rule may be in effect and the extent to which it's not going to necessarily be in effect, unless people are building roads probably to multiple lots. It's not going to be reviewed. So we have to look at the connectivity areas as covering then where the road rule will not cover. And I just interested in looking at ways to make tier 3 work, make it efficient, not as onerous, but get to the most important impacts that should be considered, versus starting with the point that we've got areas that are really sensitive. We know that. And now we need to go through an exercise of figuring out how to get it down to a very, 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 very limited basis. And then we lose sort of the value of, I think, what tier 3 was intended to do.
Yep, all good points. And I just want to say that that question about whether the road rule applies to a single driveway at 800 feet or 2,000 feet, I think will be something that our guidance will address. And I have heard differing opinions on that from some of you in this group and from some of my board members, frankly. So, the LURB figuring that out and providing our take on that, I totally agree, is going to be really important. And it's part of the reason why when my board talked about this draft, I gave them some decision points. And one of them was, are we going to go with the 800-foot buffer on these habitat connector areas or the 2,000-foot distance? Or something else entirely. And my recommendation at the time was, well, we better go with 2,000 because that's the only way to make sure that the full scope of a connectivity area, that there's no holes in there in terms of review, right? That somebody could build a driveway and 1,200 feet, not trigger the road rule, and also not end up in tier 3 and effectively destroy the habitat that in that middle distance away. And you're right. If the road rule is interpreted differently, then maybe that's no longer an issue. We can't answer that right now, but it's a good point. Billy, what do you have to say on that?
Yeah, I was just going to make a similar point that you just made, Alex. Like, I think if, as Jamie suggests, the road rule doesn't trigger for driveways less than 2,000 feet, then I think we have to be very careful with the connecting block tier 3, because I think the worst outcome would be if we create a high level of Act 250 jurisdiction along road frontages 800 feet in, and then basically just incentivize people to build driveways to punch right through that. And then now they're 1,500 feet off the road just to avoid Act 250 jurisdiction. So that is a real outcome that we absolutely must not incentivize.
Yes, I could not agree with you more. Perverse incentives like that, I don't want to be a part of that. So, okay.
Can I just, but isn't the other, I mean, I feel like I'm a little crazy here trying to go back to the legislative session. The whole selling point of the road rule was that it was going to incentivize people to build close to the road. So if we don't want them to build close to the road, because that's where there's habitat connectors, we don't want to build far away from the road because that's where there's forested areas. Where do we want people to put their homes? Because we have a housing crisis, and I know this isn't what this group is about, but that's what I'm about. And this is really a frustrating point of saying we have to keep the habitat corridors next to the road and not incentivize building away from the road. We have to build somewhere. We have people living in tents. Like, just
to be clear, Megan, my point was like sensitive to that, right? Like, we don't want to like do something that's stupid, makes it harder for people to build housing and then actually impact the resource. We need to like think of all this stuff together so that whatever we're doing works for both these goals.
Awesome. Yeah, go ahead, Seth. You're next, and we'll go to Bob.
Thank you, Alex. I think Megan's point, and just as an aside, I think housing is a consideration this group needs to think about, because this was supposed to be a balanced bill. And at least as a planner, I have an ethical obligation to think how any policy impacts disadvantaged populations. So I'm just going to put that out there, that I think housing does need to be considered in how we draw this. I think the issue that we're encountering with these habitat connectors is that there are some statewide and potentially internationally wide important connectors in Vermont. I'm thinking of Shutesville Hill in my region. There are others captured on the map that, and I'm sorry, I don't mean any offense to the people who made this. I know what you're trying to do, some very hard work here, but that are like just state highways with big forests on either side. And I'm sure there's ecological value to them, but it's not the same ecological value as some of these internationally important crossings. And I think tier 3 would, and this piece specifically, would have more buy-in from regions like the one I serve if it was more refined to those incredibly important connectors. So I'm not sure tweaking sort of buffers gets there. I think there needs to be more science behind where are we really going to have an ecological problem if we lose these. And the nice to have connectors should be dealt with voluntary land conservation and cooperation with landowners. The critical ones that are going to cause critical problems if we lose them, that should be the focus of expanded jurisdiction. Otherwise, nothing is special if we say everything is special.
Thanks, Seth. Bob, you're up.
Thanks. Appreciate both of those comments, and it kind of ties into something I was looking at before this meeting. Kind of stepping back from your buffers on the tier 3 map, Alex, which have started looking like fried eggs to me. So that's what I've been calling them in my head, the green and the yellow. And I think if we step back from those distances for a moment, the road segments, I think, are a relatively small proportion of area. So I looked at mileages from those segments, which were highest priority because they are between highest priority connecting blocks, and there's essentially all forest, almost all forest on both sides of the road. And it's something like 390 miles out of the state's 14,000 road miles that are class 3 or higher. So I think we're starting from a fairly small set of places. And if we just take the buffers out of it for a minute, I think most of those, from a scientific perspective, kind of do what Seth is saying, that you can't really have Shutesville if you can't get from Shutesville to somewhere else. And so we're sort of stuck with this challenge of how do we maintain a network? I think the main point I'm trying to get at is that I think this is limited. I think some more thinking around how these are buffered and applied makes sense, but that we're starting from something that's grounded in good science. Not perfect because it was not designed for this use, but it's good science. And I think it is a restricted set of areas that we can try to refine how we think about them, to the points of your questions.
Thanks, Bob. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So, I appreciate, the discussion here. Our concern all along has been the property owners, especially, as you look at habitat connectors along roads, smaller parcels that have been owned by families for, generations potentially, that really that's our concern, it is not overly impacting those folks. As we've looked at habitat connectors, how they get defined, I think, has been critical and defined on a map especially. My impression of the goal of the legislature was to protect truly significant or really critical habitat connectors. When I look at the map currently, I see what I feel are all habitat connectors. And, just being able to boil that down to something that is really significant, I've got to believe is a first step. The other thing that I'm curious about, and I don't have the answer to, is, in these habitat connector areas, which are right along roads where, smaller parcels of property are generally owned, how big an impact is it on private property owners? Somebody that owns 5 or 10 acres and may want to build a house down the road. And I guess I also look at these areas and think that, tier 3 and all of the environmentally sensitive areas we're considering they're not going to really be, great areas for high levels of development. For the most part, it would be single family homes, something of that nature. And, I don't see apartment buildings going in many of these areas, just not the right part of the state. You want to protect against that, but I think, to allow for reasonable use of an individual owning that property, should be part of the rules as we get to, kind of what where does the impact trigger Act 250? Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks, Peter.
that's the other side of it, is like what's allowed in a tier, what's like exempt or allowed before tier 3 kicks in some of these areas. That's another way to kind of modulate the impact of tier 3. Right now it's incredibly small, 200 square feet of new development. So like if it's a single family home, then that's maybe a different conversation with the public.
Yep, and honestly, that's where my hope was to go with refinements to the current draft, was to revisit the conversation about what would be exempt, so that people who have property in a tier 3 area have some sense of the scale of development that would be required to trigger an Act 250 permit. It's not just anything. But I think I want to reiterate what Bob said, because I heard, Peter, what you were saying, I heard at some of the public engagement sessions, and I think it's really easy to look at a particular spot and say, wow, look at all that habitat connectivity. But when you pan out a little bit, as Bob indicated, and look at how many roads are actually implicated in these habitat connectors, it is small. And when you look at the amount of forest block area that is trying to be connected, it is small. That, like, we've honed this down to just the highest priority connectivity blocks, the most intact forests on either side of certain road segments. But with that said, I'm gonna share my screen so that you can see concern that came up from one person I talked to just the other day, and that was a planning commissioner in Moortown. And some of you might know who that planning commissioner is. But in any case, she pointed out that in Moortown, the habitat connectors, in her mind, were having a disproportionate impact because there were so many of them shown on the major roads in and out of Moortown. And you can see the fried egg that Bob was talking about, with the yellow being the 800-foot buffer and the olive green being the 2,000-foot buffer. The mint green is the headwater stream areas, the steep slopes with poorly drained soils. And her point was, listen, our little exclusion areas in Moortown are very small for potential tier 1 in the future. And like the balance between those areas and how much is being indicated as tier 3 seemed off to her. And when I looked at it, I had said, okay, well, let's turn on the highest priority connectivity blocks and see what's going on there. And when I zoom out, in dark orange, you see the highest priority connectivity blocks. So these are the areas that allow plants and animals to migrate across the state and the region, as Seth was saying. And yeah, we have a couple different pathways happening here, right? There's the Green Mountains to the west of Moortown that are here. Hopefully you can see my cursor dragging along. And then you've got a little spur that's going right through Moortown here. And similarly, when you look at Duxbury, which is right next door to Moortown, it's fully within the highest priority, connectivity block area. But there are no habitat connectors, or very few, indicated, in that community because of the way roads do and do not run. So where was I going with that? I guess what I wanted to say is, I think both, everyone's right in this sense. Like Bob's right. We're not identifying huge chunks of the state that are habitat connectors. So Seth, I would respectfully disagree that we are calling everything special, and therefore nothing is special. But at the same time, there are examples like in Moortown where it seems like there's a disproportionate impact, and we need to figure out a way to address that, either through exemptions or through refined mapping, or through an out of the box idea. That's something else altogether. Okay, so enough of that. These are all really good points. Does anybody have another one before we spend the next bit of time walking down the questions I had for you? Okay, good. Let's go to my questions. So some of them people echoed in the comments, so hopefully they're relevant. And the first one was just what we were talking about. Should we refine the road-based habitat connector areas? And as I indicated, in towns like Moortown, Cabot's another town where I spoke to municipal officials there, and they were really concerned about the disproportionate amount of that particular Tier 3 area in their community. So I think we do need to refine it. In the presentations, I indicated that, we were going to skinny these down and get rid of overreach areas. I'm still committed to doing that, but I think we have bigger questions in mind. One of which is the distance, 800 feet versus 2,000 feet. The other is an idea that Josh's colleague Samantha brought up, which is, hey, we have conserved land mapping. So if you've identified a very long stretch of road as being an important habitat connector, and there's not a lot of development there, so that's why you see it all, habitat connector all along the road. If there is a conserved portion of that, do you need the rest? Like, is the conserved portion sufficient to deal with the connectivity, and you can let the rest of it go, at least in terms of a Tier 3 designation, which I thought was interesting. And it seems like from a mapping standpoint, we should be able to do that. And a more general comment that came up at one of the meetings that I thought was really spot on. It was somebody in Newport said, you got to look at the context. And his point was in Stowe, and where the Shutesville corridor is in Waterbury, there's been a lot of development. And so there are very limited connectivity areas that are super important to maintain. Otherwise you could really lose connectivity over in a whole region. But he said, there are a lot of places in the kingdom where it's mostly forested. You've identified a huge swath of road as habitat connector, but the context for that is an intact forested landscape. So is there some way to reflect that in the amount of habitat connector that you're actually mapping, given that a lot of it's there? And so those are some of the questions I posed in the email. Any thoughts? How about the first one? 800 foot, 2,000 feet. Is it an impossible question until we have an interpretation of the road rule from the board, or do people have thoughts on that?
It's going to be driven by the road rule, that's for sure.
Yeah. How about, we can come back to any of these, but how about this concept of turning off habitat connectivity areas from a Tier 3 standpoint, if there's proximity to one that's already conserved? So that's going to last and be a place that allows passage over time because of the conservation status. Maybe everything within a certain distance around it that's mapped for habitat connectivity could be turned off. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll obviously advocate for that. I think it goes to what Seth's point was too. If someone was in the position to permanently conserve this land and someone else's land, they're not in that position. Maybe that's their biggest asset. It's not really fair that if that land isn't desperately needed, that it's the most critical to not go with someone who's already chosen to permanently conserve the land that serves as the wildlife habitat connector to the forest. And not, I know it's not a taking, but take any more land that someone hasn't chosen to do that, make that the purpose of their land from someone else who hasn't and might need it for a different reason.
Samantha, looks like you're with us now. This was your idea. Go ahead.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate you bringing this to the group for their input. Would you be able to screen share and show Ripton? I think
Sure.
Ripton is a really logical, visible way to understand how this could work as a solution. Ripton is in the heart of the Green Mountain Forest. The National Forest exists on both sides of it. And most of the state highway, which is also Ripton's historic Main Street, is falling under this jurisdictional trigger.
So the map's up. I'll zoom in a little bit. There's Ripton, and you can see the road network, and along 125, the gap there, the habitat connectors, and then those running north-south from there as well.
And then I'll just say as well, really on that border, the town immediately to the right of Ripton is my town, Hancock. And pretty much on that town line are two other sweeping areas of conservation and areas that are unsuitable and unlikely for development. One is the Breadloaf campus owned by Middlebury College and a historic preservation site. The other, also owned by Middlebury College, is a resource-driven recreation site, which is the Snow Bowl, right? So all throughout this really critical transportation corridor between Addison, Orange, and Washington County, you have a substantial amount of forested land that is under permanent conservation. But here you have poor little Ripton sort of swallowed up by Tier 3 right in its village area.
So I think that's fairly straightforward for folks to understand. I'm going to stop the share.
Yep.
Let's keep talking about it. Charlie, you're next.
I think the idea of excluding these connectivity areas when they include or fall adjacent to conserved lands that come to and are conserved on both sides of the roads, that makes a lot of sense in principle. And I think it's worth looking at. My only concern would be that in some areas, conservation has been very opportunistic and not necessarily directed at functions and values. And so the conserved land might not actually be what is the kind of highest functionality and value when it comes to conservation. There's also that question of like, is the conserved land on both sides of said road, or is it only on one side of the road? What is the impact there? So I think it warrants looking at, and I get it, makes sense in principle. Like, you don't need this whole stretch to be a connectivity zone if you've got a significant chunk of it already conserved. I just think that when you get to the granularity of each one of these zones, you might have to look at the actual functions and values that you're looking at in the landscape context. And to that end, I don't know to what degree at some point, like, all of this is going to kind of get a fine-tooth comb look to make sure that what we're showing on the maps is what we want to show and reflects what we want it to reflect, since a lot of it was generated by, I think, kind of like, here's the prompt input to the mapping and show me this versus like what's behind it. So thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. Jamie?
Yeah, it's an interesting proposal, and I'm interested to hear what Bob says, because it does feel like we would benefit from understanding, like, from an ecological perspective, if there's a certain amount of conservation in a certain area, then like it gets to the functionality of the area, and what would be remaining that would be key in order to maintain that functionality, which kind of gets me back to the point, because I think we're all sort of operating almost under the assumption that the Act 250 is like a barrier. There's a cost to it. I mean, most projects are approved. I get it. People don't want to go through Act 250. And I totally hear you, Megan, that we've got a housing crisis and we need to determine where we're going to build the homes. And we've got to figure out if the homes are being built in these critical connectivity areas. I guess I'm just going to come back to my point that, is there some way for us to design a workable approach here? Well, what we're talking about is trying to get people not to have an undue adverse fragmentation impact when they're designing their home. And so hopefully for most people, that's not a barrier. And so I'd like to sort of almost like turn this around and try and approach this in like a solution focused way. Like, is there a problem there to try and get that, at least that basic level of review and incentive for people to do good site design, and then not see this so much as a barrier that homes won't be built in these areas? It's just, what does the site design look like?
Thanks, Jamie. Bob.
I think this is an intriguing idea, and I think the Ripton example is a really good one. Could you bring that back up, Alex?
Yes.
Could you turn on the reference areas, the blocks? So I was just going to point out a couple of things to just put a finer point on what Samantha was saying. Because of the Green Mountain National Forest and all the road frontage on 125, there's no concern about maintaining connectivity between the forest block to the north, which is at the Breadloaf Wilderness, and whatever's to the south, which is another wilderness area. The little bits of edge that get picked up by those eggs are kind of irrelevant, given that you've got, I think, miles of undeveloped, permanently conserved wilderness. I mean, it's about as strong a protection as you can get. So there's that one. There's the little linear north-south block to the left. And I think it makes sense to kind of look at this at a block by block or road by road context. So I know less about what's going on there. I think we'd want to evaluate them sort of block by block, and which blocks are well connected through conserved lands and which are not. And that's not a scientific analysis we've ever done, at least not really in the way we're talking about now. I think it's something that could be done, and I think a scientific analysis would be the way to do this fairly, or at least to bring some grounding to it, rather than just sort of like it looks like it's good, to the points Charlie was making. But that's not something that can happen in like 2.5 weeks before Christmas. I think that just goes back to the need to really take time on the process.
Thanks, Bob. Seth, you're next.
So I like the concept of thinking about, in some way, in some kind of analysis of where there is conserved and protected land, and whether the functions of these crossings are actually being are being met through that. I think that this discussion does impact why, for some of us who are in or represent the regions that are concerned about disproportionate impact, that discussion has to be part of this discussion, because my reaction to it's only a small subset of Vermont roadways is that a heck of a lot of those Vermont roadways are in communities I serve, and some of them are the only places where people can build that's not a steep slope, wetland, or floodplain. That's the reality. And I would much rather be working with the people to think in those communities, to think about how to work with landowners to improve the functionality of that, whether that's through simplified site plan review. I don't know if there's a way to turn Act 250 into simplified site plan review. I like that idea, Jamie, if there's a way to actually do it within the framework. That's what we've tried to do with zone subdivision in a lot of these communities. But I'd also just want to say the statement about this doesn't mean you can't build there, it just means you have to go through Act 250. I understand the spirit behind that, but there's another interpretation of that, which is that, and I know this isn't what people in this group mean when they say that, but it's that the people who can afford to go through the additional cost of Act 250 can build here and the rest of us can't. So I don't think we can disconnect these different discussions. I think that, like, really, if we're going to do this, we have to find a way for the Act 250 review process to be a simplified site plan review process that does things like ensure buffers between properties or maintains hedgerows or things like that, and not the other stuff that can make the process a 5-letter word that I got from a property owner to describe it this morning. So I'll leave it with that because I've already talked a lot today.
Seth, email me that 5-letter word. You got to have a running list of all of the colorful descriptions. Adam.
So I'm going to be really brief because Seth just said a lot of the things I was going to. I think Samantha's idea is a very, very good idea. The other road that you were looking at just south of 125 is the Ripton Goshen Road. It's basically in the Green Mountain National Forest as well. It's the border of the Muslamu National Recreation Area. So there's an awful lot of conserved land along that road as well. And I think it's important to consider. I also did like Jamie's idea of, not of site plan review, of the functionality of what we're trying to do. We're trying to allow people to have reasonable uses of their property, and we're also trying to basically protect habitat corridors or natural resources. And I like move it here, not there, rather than your in Act 250 approach. So I know that's going way, way backwards, but I think it has a lot of merit. That's an agency permit, if need be.
Thanks, Adam. Okay. Let's move on, unless there are more hands. So one question that's come up a couple times, and actually I posed it to Bob at one point myself, was if the habitat connector areas that sometimes string along large segments of road, linearly speaking, have some issues, and the perception of them has, involved some issues as well. Should we be focused instead on a smaller subset that focuses just on these, I think as Seth termed them, sort of globally significant, or at least, regionally in the northern forest significant connector areas, instead of this GIS analysis that, could establish an important habitat connector anywhere where there's a highest priority connectivity block on either side. And Bob, you're going to want to speak to this, I think, but when Bob and I talked about this, I think the idea was we don't know where those are, right? Like Shutesville is the easy one that everyone points to because it's been in the news and people know about it, and it is pretty limited, and so you can sort of see it when you look at the mapping. but if there are 9 others, because we always have to have a top 10 list in life, and so there's 10 of them in the state, like where are the other 9? We don't necessarily know where they are. So that's sort of one issue with this concept of jettisoning this road-based habitat connector mapping methodology. And the other is that, the reason that Shutesville exists and is so publicized is because so much habitat destruction has happened there that it's winnowed it down to just a few patches that are left to connect to. And so part of the beauty of this road-based system is to say, well, where we have intact connectivity, we ought to design to keep it and not end up with just these tiny little slices. That's all that's left. So anyways, I'm curious what people think about whether or not to try to get rid of this road-based habitat connector mapping in place of something much more limited. Go ahead, Warren.
I'll probably sound like a broken record, but I'll say the answer is yes, but mostly because I think there was an expectation that what we were looking at was, when we were talking about this over the past several bienniums, that we were looking at areas that rise to a certain level of significance, like Shutesville Hill. So I think there was an expectation, and I'm not saying it was based in science. I'm just giving you sort of the reality of being in the process over over a couple bienniums. I think there was an expectation created that it was going to be limited, and I think it does say, the language does say of statewide significance, and I realize from understanding how the GIS layers were, how the information was created, that you think those are areas of statewide significance. So I'm not arguing that, but I'm saying the expectation was certainly different going into this. So I'm not suggesting there's a scientific basis. I'm giving you what I think is the sort of political basis and the expectation that was created, that we were talking about areas that were incredibly significant for the state to maintain connectivity between mountain ranges and large areas. And what I think came out is much more sweeping than what people anticipated. So that's my basis for saying it. Not, again, it's not a scientific basis. It's just giving folks a full context for those that weren't involved in this for several years.
What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I'll kind of go back to the very first question I asked in the very first meeting, which is, why didn't we first evaluate our public owned lands and our permanently conserved lands and overlay them with what our critical areas were first, and then develop a plan for the ones that weren't already conserved or publicly owned to minimize the impact on privately owned lands? And we'd have a much smaller problem if we already knew what the critical areas we've already protected within these criteria are, and then find a way to right size that and affect less property owners and concerned citizens and municipalities. Sort of, it dovetails with the approach of the 30 by 30, the 50 by 50. It's if we all say that, you're right, Act 250 isn't a barrier to development. You just have to have enough money to get through the process. And if we say we can have agriculture there, we can have, then the critical 3 areas that we're capturing up in this aren't actually preserved anyways. And so it just feels like a very long bureaucratic process that has real consequences for private owners and equity issues that might not accomplish the end goal. And I know you didn't write the legislation, and I know we're all trying to go through the rules, but it just feels like that cross-pollination of an inventory of what's already protected and what we need to conserve, because I don't want to destroy absolute critical habitat, areas either, but I don't know that we've minimized the impact on actual property owners to achieve that goal.
Gotcha. Thanks, Josh. So, I'm not a super sensitive person, but but you struck a little bit of chord in me in that, um, it's impossible to look at the conserved lands in the first place and understand how, what resources need to be protected with those conserved areas in mind, because you don't know what resources you want to protect in the first place. So like we didn't start with that. Sorry, I couldn't start with that because I needed to have a better understanding of which resources were the ones that deserved to be considered through an Act 250 review process. But I think we're at the point where what you're saying, now we can do it, right? That was Samantha's suggestion, at least with the habitat connectors, and maybe with, you know, the other parts of tier 3 as well. But I think now is the time we can overlay the conservation protected lands database and have a better sense of like where we're already looking great in a particular region or block, and where, oh my goodness, like we don't have much of and we do need more regulation of development in that particular spot. So I think it's ripe now.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to say you didn't decide to do this. I just, as far as a process, you're right. We're starting to refine this, and if we have an inventory of conserved lands, both public and private, what are they concerned for? We must have an inventory of what the values of those properties are and why we're doing it. Just, to me, I'm not in this space that enough, but there's got to be that value there to do this in a way that minimizes some of these impacts and has the end goal that everyone shares in mind, with minimal impact. But I hear you.
Yep. Go ahead, Seth.
Timeline for how we got to where we are aside, I do think that overlaying this area with the conserved land area and then having Bob and team do some kind of analysis of which of these are the ones that are at threat, or would need greater protection than is provided by conservation would be a good tool. I'm looking at roughly the areas of most concern in my region, and there are corridors of protection through many of them on both sides of the road. And I think that the temperature would go down if people, and again, in one of them, it is 2 corridors of land trust protection, some easements that are wildlife passage easements, which I wasn't aware was a thing, but whoever came up with that is a cool person. It might be Charlie. And then the only places where people have been able to build because of soils and wetlands and other constraints in that community. If that conserved land is providing the connectivity and we can leave those people alone and let them subdivide land for their kids, I think the pressure from rural communities is going to go down. And so I'd like to step back and have that analysis before we decide whether this element, or before we decide how this element is incorporated into the rule. I think we're on a pathway for something that could work, but I'd like to see that on not just 5 minutes during a meeting looking at a map.
Gotcha. Reasonable request. Bob?
I had all sorts of thoughts and now I've lost track of what I was going to say. I think mostly was thinking about, Josh, we do have a very up-to-date conserved lands inventory that can be brought to this because of Act 59, private and public land. Thinking about what Warren was saying about the critical points, I kind of wish there was a way to get to like these 10. And I think the challenge just goes back to like what's regionally significant is connecting the Adirondacks to Maine and Canada, connecting the Berkshires to the Sutton Mountains in Quebec. And so it's not the regional significance is these X of lines across Vermont. And I just think it doesn't make sense to put a regulatory burden on people at one point in that pathway if other points in that pathway are just not regulated at all. And so you're protecting something one place that might not actually achieve the end goal. That doesn't seem like an equitable or reasonable solution. Trying to figure out how to do this in a scale that works but maintains the full length of connectivity seems like a better outcome to my mind, if we can strike that balance. I think the conserved lands is good. The other piece that I think is really getting us hung up is those 2,000 feet and 800-foot buffers. They're making it look like eggs because they're going in all directions, including laterally along the road. And I think if we go back to the actual places identified in the conservation design, they're just much, much less, and like shouldn't be picking up downtown Ripton because that's not forest. And I think there's a potential, if we can figure out how to make those shapes much more targeted to the actual forested crossings, I think we could cut out a significant amount of area. I mean, if it's only a couple hundred miles of road, if you extend each of those crossings by 2,000 feet in either direction, you're picking up a huge amount of incidental area. And I think I think that was sort of recognized before, but this just really puts a fine point that we should figure out another way to draw those shapes.
Right, people. It's 2:36 on my cell phone. We have a few more questions that I pose. So let's get to them. How about, I think my question sort of stems from a comment Billy made, which is that the exemptions do allow you to tailor this with regard to types of development that are going to get swept into Act 250 review and types of development that aren't at a scale junction. And as you all know, in the first draft, we had talked about like a third of an acre's worth of impact within a tier 3 area as potentially being exempt. And the board rejected that idea. They felt that that was so large that you could potentially have a significant natural community on a parcel and eliminate it entirely if the development just happened to be in that one spot. But what was landed on with 200 square feet or less as being the exemption is pretty small and doesn't allow for a whole lot, with the understanding that that exemption also applies to, does not apply to the area around existing structures. So my questions were, do folks think that we should tinker with the exemptions to push them back, to blow them back up a little bit, to allow impacts of more than 200 square feet, or maybe to codify a larger area around existing structures, maybe more comparable with the Vermont Conservation Design mapping that tends to have a buffer of, I think, Bob, it's about 150 feet swinging around existing structures. And so those areas sort of fall out anyways. They're not meant to be mapped as habitat connectors and the like. So sorry, a little muddled there, but thoughts on exemption expansion? Good, bad, specific ideas? Go ahead, Peter.
Great, thanks. And I thought that a couple of comments by Billy were really good here. And this is, in other words, before you get kicked into Act 250 in these zones, if the exemption is correct, then you're having the kind of management you're looking for. To have existing or exemption by use is something I think about. If somebody said, look, this has been in our family for years, we want Johnny or Joey to build a single family home, that ought to have that ought to have the space to build a single family home, you know, which was in our estimate, 15,000 feet might be a little bit small, but certainly, you know, was a number that I think is, you know, makes more sense. If somebody says, I want to build, you know, I don't know, an industrial facility or you know, an apartment building, that, you know, that would get trigger Act 250 more quickly. But I do think that, you know, site design may be the way to accomplish this for both. And I'm not, you know, I mean, do you get too chopping things up into a million different pieces? You know, I wouldn't, you know, want to go that direction, but I do think that you know, there ought to, you know, as you look at the intended use, that ought to be a consideration of whether, you know, that project gets pushed into Act 250 or not.
Peter? One idea that I think we had kicked around early on, but didn't land in the draft was to consider exemptions, to differentiate exemption areas, allowed exemption areas by the type of tier 3 resource. So potentially for a rare significant natural community, have a smaller exemption area allowed than in a habitat connector area, which is still important, but is not necessarily as constrained to a specific point in space that a natural community might be. So that might be another way to crack the nut, understanding that it's the habitat connector areas as we're currently mapping them that are the you know, the most land occupy the greatest amount of land area in the tier 3 realm. Any other thoughts though on ways to structure exemptions to address some of the concerns that have come up? All right. Keep thinking on that. Oh, sorry, Annette.
Yeah, I do want to note that I think we're a little limited in our larger discussion because we don't have Liz Thompson, Dory Barton, or Mark Lappin with us. And so the focus on the actual ecological aspects, I mean, we have Bob Zano, but I am concerned that this meeting is not as inclusive of the areas that we need to be talking about because we're lacking the ecologists.
Yeah, thanks for putting that on the record, Annette. I appreciate that. And I'll make an effort to reach out to them directly after this to encourage them to give me some thoughts and review the notes and the recording if possible. Okay, well, sorry, Jay, go ahead.
I think if you focus on the area of disturbance around an existing structure, then I think, like to Annette's point, it would just be helpful to know like what is a reasonable, you know, buffer area that would likely not have a detrimental impact on, you know, connectivity areas. I think your point's well taken. With natural communities, that may be more sensitive, but for the other tier 3 areas, then there's likely a more logical buffer. I don't know what that is. I'd have to kind of look at the science or hear from the ecologists, like what's reasonable. Certainly something more than 200 square feet, because I think that is just being seen as too de minimis. And then I don't know, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but I feel like I do need almost like assistance from you, Alex, or somebody at the LURB to understand if there was going to be an exemption that was created, could there be built in sort of like criteria that if you're going to do certain type of development and you cite it in a certain way, then you're exempt. You know, it's kind of like trying to still get at this approach, like how do we drive something that would allow people not to go through the process if they're doing the right sort of incentivized site design, and maybe that would capture more broad activities on a parcel, as long as it's being designed well. And I realize, I think the question would be that may then require some kind of JO or district coordinator review to make a final determination. But it would just help me to know if that's even a viable option, or would that have to be like a legislative sort of like authorized provision.
Yeah, I'm really, I'm really concerned about that as an idea to try to pursue. From the get-go, we've been talking about, and our staff at the Act 250 program has been talking about needing to have a jurisdictional triggers that are clear and simple, and don't require a landowner to hire a professional to determine whether a property is going to be jurisdictional or not. And so to have to do a qualitative assessment of a development plan or a design for a development ahead of the development even happening, the plans could change. It just seems really problematic, but I'm I'm willing to take the question to into the program and try to get you an answer on that, because I do understand what you're talking about. And yeah, if it would be great if a simplified site plan design like Seth keeps talking about was something that could be evaluated and then jurisdiction dispensed with if the site plan was adequate. But to some degree, that's sort of like cart before the horse with criterion 8C and how we're going to have design standards within that. So Seth, what do you have to follow that?
Well, you kind of said it probably won't work, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think at one point, BNRC had some outlines of things for realtors to consider with site plan layout that were sort of basic standards for exactly what Jamie is talking about. I think just big picture, the difference between administrative minor and major in Act 250 is very different than the difference between administrative minor and major with the local review process, and big picture investigating that a little bit. And there are at the local level communities who do have administrative review that is a staff level non-board review that can take into account quite a bit of things. And Act 250 moving in that process for some smaller applications, again, might take some of the fear that people are feeling about this jurisdictional expansion away, and may also mean that the equity issue of needing advanced lawyers and engineers for a simple project goes away. So cart before the horse, but you need both the cart and the horse to get the grain to market. So they both have to be there.
I am never going to be able to compete with your metaphors and analogies, Seth. That's pretty good. Okay. So next question, subdivision. So I've had a couple of regional planners tell me, why on earth would the jurisdiction not extend to subdivisions on properties that have tier 3 areas? That's how you get good design, is by reviewing the development before the land is fragmented and divided up. So I don't know that our group talked about this a whole lot. I know that my board did, and they were adamant that they did not want jurisdiction to attach to a property that was just going through subdivision. They really wanted it connected to the actual impact. But that doesn't mean that their minds can't be changed. So I'm curious what you all think, if you have any thoughts about whether tier 3 jurisdiction should apply to subdivision. And you don't have to have any thoughts, because we can move on to the next question. We only have 11 minutes left.
I value the wisdom of the LAIRB board in this instance.
I'll
Take note of that.
you, Billy. Okay, well, we can keep talking, or you can get back to me, but I'm going to keep moving. We also had a comment at one of the public hearings. I think it was specifically the Windsor one. The person was somewhat shocked that we were not including any agricultural soils in the tier 3 areas, prime agricultural soils. And I remember we had these conversations early on about, the third rail or whatever the right metaphor is. Seth's better at that than I am. About, ag and forest uses and bringing those into Act 250 jurisdiction, and that we didn't want that to happen. But I wonder if maybe our working group and the board got something a little lost in translation, because we could very easily exempt agricultural uses as the current draft does and still have jurisdiction over non-agricultural uses on prime ag soils. And that might extend the coverage of tier 3 areas into parts of the state that have very little of it right now, which is also a concern that I've heard at some of these meetings, is that this current tier 3 mapping is focused on all the forested areas, and it lets the Champlain Valley off the hook, where there are important agricultural areas. So thoughts?
No, nay, never. Don't do it. Don't do it. You'll cover all of Addison County, and you get back to the disproportional impacts, and you get it's just a bad idea.
Isn't this sort of, if that was to
from the
be
Secretary of the Agency of Agriculture, so you're not alone. Mr. Tebbett said that there are lots of other ways that Vermont does a good job of conserving agricultural soils, and that we don't need Act 250 involved in that. Josh, sorry, I cut you off.
No. It just sort of, I don't understand the concern. I mean, if you were saying protect agricultural soils, but if they were going to be agriculture, they're already exempt anyway. So I just don't understand.
Yeah. So let me clarify. This person said, so when a piece of agricultural soils gets developed and turned into houses,
right?
Why wouldn't that trigger Act 250? So right now, the only way that would trigger Act 250 is by the size of the development under the traditional Act 250 triggers, right? Her point was, don't we want to conserve important agricultural soils just as much as we want to conserve important forest blocks? So why wouldn't we want there to be good design through a review process if a farm was about to be chopped up into a residential subdivision, in order to preserve as much of the ag soils and cluster the development in a way that doesn't impact them as much?
Yeah, no, don't expand it. I mean, the areas to look at, the critical habitat repair, they were very well spelled out, and this would add a massive expansion.
Any other thoughts on that one? Okay. So this is a little bit of a corollary, and it's the last question, so we'll wrap with this. We've talked a lot about disproportionate impacts, particularly with regard to the habitat connectivity blocks or areas. Are we missing important tier 3 areas in more developed parts of the state? I spoke with one person, forget where he was, what part of the state he was from, who said, you're letting everything in Chittenden County off the hook. Like, it's all going to be excluded because it's going to be growth area and in those special future land use types. If this is supposed to be, equally applied to all important resources, why is it all exempt over there? And so it made me wonder, are we missing things? Are there important resources, or are we overdoing it on the exclusion zones? Thoughts on that? Sorry that these questions are so big and hard to get your head around, but that's how I operate. Go ahead, Charlie.
I'm just curious, was the comment you got based on their projected idea of what the planned growth areas would be, or based on looking at a map that actually showed tier 3 areas as potentially prescribed for Chittenden County? Because when you look at the map, I mean, there's a lot of road connectors, there's a lot of significant natural communities, a lot of upland stream areas. So was the concern based on the thought of what's going to be excluded based on growth, or based on what's showing up on the maps?
Yeah, honestly, I think this person's thought was more centered in how much of the area in their part of the state was being mapped as tier 3 and their perception of how little was being mapped in Chittenden County. Um, and so I think it was a fairness. They felt like there was an inherent unfairness in the differential mapping, but I don't think that this person was actually doing an intensive study of the maps. This was just an impression that they had, but it struck a chord with me. And so I thought it would be worth bringing it to all of you just to see if, we're headed down the right road with these exclusion areas and whether we've missed a resource that's particularly important, like agricultural soils in the Champlain Valley. Adam, go ahead.
So I tell you, in Chittenden County by far has the most mapped potentially tier 1 area, 1A or 1B. I think it adds up to somewhere 12 or 13% of that area, which is probably more in line with if you added up all the the proposed tier 3 areas. It's probably more equal, whereas the rest of the state are between 0.6, I think, in the Northeast Kingdom, and 0.3 or 3%, 4% maybe for all the other areas. So I guess I would suggest that he didn't look at the maps very well.
Gotcha. Seth?
Just follow up. I think, that perception is out there. It may be helpful to deaggregate the tier 3 areas by region just to see if that is in fact concentrated more in some part of the state than the other, or if Chittenden County is significantly less. I suspect we might be surprised due to some of the sensitive natural areas along the shore of Lake Champlain, but maybe not. But before having a discussion about do we need to add more in the urban areas, we should probably make sure that they are underrepresented, as some are assuming in this area. I'd rather we think about how rural areas have greater access to tier 1A and 1B than expand tier 3 in Chittenden County, because people need places to live. But I've said that several times today.
Gotcha. Yes. Well, because my board has been reviewing the Chittenden County Regional Plan of late, it was made clear to us that I believe it's 25% of the statewide housing goal or target is supposed to be absorbed in Chittenden County. So there is a reason why there's that much potential tier 1 in Chittenden County, because it's a highly developed landscape, even if over 80% of it is still rural and forested and the like. Okay. That's all I had, and we're just about out of time. So I guess what I want to tell you all is thank you for taking another couple hours to talk about this stuff. I hear the concern about going off half-cocked with the next draft and not having time for the working group to see it and to sort of work through it. So I'll do my best to, keep you involved and continue to run things by you. But I would like to hold your feet to the fire and say, if you have follow-up comments that you want to render in writing, please do that. It's helpful for me to have, actual words on a page that I can share with the board and that I can point to if you're brave enough to do that. And I would love to get those, in the next week or so, or a couple weeks actually. And I've been telling the public, just get me comments on this first draft or the draft we're in right now by the end of the calendar year. So I'm treating you a little differently. I want yours sooner, but that's sort of where we're headed. And I will endeavor to reconvene this group in January before we go too much farther, so that you all feel like you have an opportunity to see what we're doing, both on the analysis side, the mapping side, and the drafting of the rules side. Josh?
I just had a clarifying question. I don't know if I wrote it down right in the beginning. As far as the sort of new timeline that you were thinking, you're going to be reviewing these comments, You're going to be then the LURB's going to be discussing or developing a draft 3 in the late January, February, March timeframe. Is that, and then putting out to the public for final comment in the spring, with it going to final rule in June or July?
So we actually have a two-step happening next, which is I make revisions, I bring it to the board to discuss. It sounds like folks on this group would like to have an opportunity to discuss as well in January. Then the next draft, draft 3, goes out to the public in February, March. That's the first step of the dance. And then
Yep.
the second step is, based on the reaction to that third draft, we make another round of revisions and come back to the public in May and say, here's, we've been to you twice. Here's the
Yep.
final version. You get one more crack at it, and then we're going to tidy it up. That's the plan. Peter?
Yeah, thanks. So I would be really interested in seeing the conserved land mapping overlay on the map that we've been working with.
Yeah.
I think that would be super helpful. And then, trying to understand, how many private parcels are actually impacted by the, Habitat Connector is the one that I think is going to have the greatest impact on private landowners. Other things may be a little bit different, but and I don't know how to get at that, but more of the conserved land piece, because I do feel like, we have so much of Vermont conserved, and we're looking at other areas, just we need to interface those two. And I think that was a big part of the discussion today. So thank you. Appreciate everybody here. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That's a great suggestion. I'll get on that right away to try to get that protected lands, conserved lands data set up on the Tier 3 viewer as a reference area. And again, thank you all. I do want to do this table of land uses by region and municipality, and I've been waiting to do it because I didn't want to use a Tier 3 set of mapping that is going to go completely out the window. So there's a little bit of chicken and egg with that, but I do intend to put that together so we can have actual numbers in terms of land area to talk about in the future regarding disproportionate impacts by town or by region. Okay, we're at time. Thank you all.
Great. Happy holidays, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.